All right, recording you go whenever you're ready.
Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. So, starting our part 8 of Peace v. Freedom.
It might be seven.
What?
I think it's seven.
Okay. Well, 7 or 8, one of the two. We're starting to lose track. Um, but you'll know. We um we were talking about, the stupidity of anarchy and about how like there's a reason why over history we've there have been very few examples since I don't know the past 2-3 thousand years, of readily accessible, somewhat universal written history, whether it be in North Africa, Middle East, Europe, Asia for the most part. We ever in all those areas, we hear about governments, we hear about some sort of governing body, and even in the places and where there wasn't the written word, there is oral history of tribal associations that would keep the peace. There'd be something that would keep the people in check, because you cannot leave people to their own devices. There are people that give really convincing arguments for why the state is terrible, and about how if we could just reform anarchy in such a way that there is a tiny bit of order, that it might somehow help, but you just at one point you have to step back and realize that anarchy as a general idea, as being stateless, does not work. Because even if you were to go to 1800, 1900, when the benefits of globalization weren't as obvious, and people for the most part still relied upon the things that they had around them, they were somewhat self-sufficient. Not everyone was. What if you live in a place that does not have a lot of natural resources, that does not have a lot of water sources? Like what if you live in a place that does not have all that? And so everyone starts going over to the same place to fight over that resource that they need, because without a state, there is no organized trade. So that's one of the things that we were really hitting on in the last episode. And with this one, we're going to really look at the some balances in today's world between those that prioritize peace versus those that prioritize freedom, with a somewhat with an imbalance over, with some having a better balance than others. Um, and we will trying to see how I want to go about this. I had this little joke, about anarchism, but I don't know. Maybe I'll spare you guys of that. I don't know. I know nowadays, like when I think about like why anarchy doesn't make any sense, I tend to kind of go back over to that Trump speech from 4th of July in 2020, in a completely different context, when he said like the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters. You know, I don't know. I just when I think about this, I think about like how it can apply, and I'm like, I don't know, just like the people that want anarchy, they want certain things that come from a globalist trade-based society with a certain sense of order, and that comes from government. The same people that want anarchy also want other things from the pleasures of life, and they have to understand that they will not have that in an anarchist society. So I don't know. I mean, of course, the context of Trump's quote right there about the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters, was talking about people that really did want freedom, that wanted a reform, not necessarily a revolution. But the people that do want anarchy are the people that are an incredible imbalance to organize society, that keeps people from fighting and killing each other. And so, in some ways, you know, the idea that these people are dangerous to society, like the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the leaders, I think does actually hold up. It's just in the political agenda that Trump was trying to further was trying to expand upon. It was not with the correct frame of mind in which that was supposed to be, in which that should have been interpreted. Because many of the people, of course, in the streets of 2020 and summer of 2020, protesting police brutality, were not trying to overthrow the United States government. They just wanted a reform. But I don't know. I don't know. It was originally a joke, but I'm thinking about it more and more, and I'm like, this may actually be a legitimate warning. You know, anarchism does not work, Marxism does not work, communism does not work, you know, and it has been tried. So,
Yeah, I get reminded of a speech um that we'll end up referencing way later in our series from Ronald Reagan. It was part of the tear down this wall speech. And at the very end, he wanted to like acknowledge the people who had protested him coming to Berlin and giving another speech, all of that. And he said, quote, in regards to those people. I wonder if they have ever asked themselves that if they should have the kind of government they apparently seek, no one would be able to do what they're doing again. End quote. That basically is in reference to people protesting for communism against America, against Reagan coming to that thing, all that. What you kind of get here is that the people who are advocating for anarchy, for communism, I wonder how much they really continue down that line of thought of what that would actually end up as. Like in this speech, Reagan was referencing the right to protest. Like in a communist government, there's no option for those people to be protesting. There wouldn't be. I mean, they would either been courted out, arrested, or sometimes even shot. It's a liberal system that they're even able to protest in. It's a liberal system that in 2020 where we were able to protest in. If people were to have, if these anarchists, these communists were to have the state or the non-state that they so seek, they would not be able to do anything that they were even doing. You can't protest in a communist government. It doesn't work. And so you just, what he had in that quote just really harps back on that. On, I do wonder if they really do think deeply on what they are like advocating for, on how what that would actually mean for them in the things that they would lose in that government or
right.
non-government.
It's um it's interesting because obviously in the USSR people weren't allowed to protest. In Cuba or modern day China, you know, or North Korea, you aren't allowed to protest. So like we are now reaching that part of this series where we're starting to begin to come at a conclusion, and that's through a comparison between two societies that one that favors peace and one that favors freedom. Now, it's also interesting to mention that one has a better balance than the other, but we'll get to that. So we want to compare China versus America, and modern day China under the CCP and America as it is today. So in China, peace is more important than freedom. You know, in China, they have a term in which they describe social harmony. Um, I'm going to attempt to pronounce it, but I'll just spell it afterwards. I think it's pronounced Zhonghua or maybe Zhongguo. You know, it's spelled Zhongguo. You can look it up. They have their own political philosophy behind social harmony because they believe that it is much more important for the people to all just accept that they are part of the collective and get rid of their own personal freedom, or at least not prioritize it for the benefit of the collective. So trumping civil rights, because that's the important thing to look at when you're looking at China. you're not just looking at social harmony. You're not just looking at the people all wanting to help each other. You're talking about leaning more on the other side of totalitarianism in the sense that they want peace, sure, but does the government that that rules the country and the party of which there's over 100 million members in the country, all meant to keep the rest of the people in line, do they really want civil rights? Because so I guess you could theoretically prioritize peace over freedom, but only if you had enough freedom to feel free. But do you feel free in a place like China? In America, I could say, kill President Biden. I hate President Biden. Hang President Biden. But in China, you could not say that about Xi Jinping. If I were to say that in China, anywhere outside of my own home or even within my home, then I'd be always terrified of whether or not there's a government agent nearby me and they'll send me over to some prison, you know, and then also civil rights in the sense of so many different other things, but like they have the one child policy that they just recently revoked. Um, like China has a very interesting way of making fun of American politics. With the recent reversal of the Roe v. Wade decision, Chinese propaganda services, the state propaganda piece, they were mouthpiece. They were criticizing America for that action, and I say rightfully so. But then they wanted to say that China has always been for women's rights. It has always been for bodily autonomy. But that is a joke because, and I don't even know to the full extent of what the CCP has done in this area, but it went from forcing women to have babies to forcing them to only have one baby
Yeah.
to forcing them again to have more babies. So it's all based on force. It's not bodily autonomy. They are taking drastic action, sometimes like having like cutting your pay, or the doctors will sabotage your child. Like they will break a bone in your newborn child during the birth procedure if it happens to have been your second child and not your first under the one child policy. They did not have bodily autonomy. They were forcing everyone to do whatever they wanted. And so that's just an example about how China does not care about civil rights because they're so focused on this peace that just because the government said one child policy, that everyone is supposed to fall into that. And if they don't, they will be punished. Not just punished in the sense of like you get a fine or you don't get government assistance, you know, like no, it's like we will physically damage your child and then we'll put you in prison. We will send your child away to another country or whatever, or we'll kill you. So yeah.
Yeah, one of the biggest examples of civil rights being not as important as in China is the right to protest. I mean, in the United States, it's enshrined in our Constitution that people have the right to peacefully assemble and to protest the government or anything such as like that. We've had Supreme Court cases that have expanded that right, um, such as I think it was Texas v. Johnson in '86, which allowed, flag burning to be an acceptable point, like part of protest. And even now, we have free speech and protest has been expanded so much that we have a quote unquote, a problem with hate speech, speech that may not be very acceptable socially, but it's still protected under our First Amendment. And if it's political, it's still kind of under that realm. So in the United States, we have enshrined in our way of government an acceptance of criticism or the allowance of criticism for the government in there. For China, it's completely the opposite. And clamping down on protests has been as it's been as common. It's just been basically part of the CCP since it's been there. Of course, the biggest one that, of course, everyone really knows about is Tiananmen Square in 1989. Student protesters gunned down on the streets, ran over by tanks for simply trying to protest. Um, but any sort, and then also Hong Kong much recently, which was having a lot more protest, wanting greater autonomy or just kind of any sort of basic rights. All of these protests get immediately and very forcefully clamped down, and the police will go searching for you if you participated in them. If they see your face, you will probably get arrested. That has happened, especially in Hong Kong, with their recent like quote unquote national security laws that was really aimed to target former and current like protesters. And so in China, what's most important is that social harmony, that peace, that stability that any sort of protest or dissent seek doesn't really seek or but just promotes um, disruption to. Another kind of big one that we've referenced this in some of our past series, such in ethno nationalism when we looked at Xi Jinping, the treatment of the Uyghur population in China. This is another perfect example of civil rights being way less important than peace, because should civil rights, of course, be made important, then the acceptance of practicing religion, the freedom to express your religion, your language, anything like that would be protected. However, going from the what changed in the 1980s of China giving autonomy to Uyghurs and other minority groups throughout the country to the forced internment and re-education camps that we have now in modern day China, is a complete change in any sort of idea, like any sort of interpretation that you may think that they value civil rights more than peace. You can't get that. You see, as I said, it's the complete opposite, because things such as protest and even diversity essentially are seen as things that can disrupt this peace, can disrupt this social harmony. If a minority group such as the Uyghurs, they have a different religion than the majority of China. They might have a different language, and to the Chinese government, they could see this as a threat, because those people might start demanding, autonomy. They might think that they don't need to be part of the Chinese state. They want their own country. What does that cause? Division, conflict, um, disruption. And that's the absolute worst thing that can happen for the Chinese government and just Chinese society as a whole, is that disruption to the social harmony, to the peace, which is paramount for the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. So when you look at the law, in China, the law is incredibly flexible, and along with that, the truth is also very flexible. On their propaganda, you find on their state mouthpiece propaganda, you find a lot of contradictions. I just mentioned, women's rights and bodily autonomy and all that, but also um, the way how they like to paint the current PRC under the CCP as being a true communist society, in where the people receive the benefits, or a socialist society, in where the government that still exists supposed to provide for the people, that it's some sort of utopia in a way, but I've heard, I'd have to verify this, but I've heard that social services really aren't as great as you would think they would be in an ideal socialist and close to communist society. Um, but in general, like the law is very flexible. If you so much as speak against the government, you could be taken away, but you may not actually be advocating for the death of Xi Jinping. You may not be advocating for the CCP to be taken down. You just have a complaint about the state. You have a complaint about the current government. You live in Shanghai and you're starving because of the COVID procedures. But if the government hears you make a complaint, then you will be taken away. So The truth is very flexible in China, and what they choose to put the full extent of the law onto you is very um, it's very extreme. It's very extreme. And right now, in China, personal freedoms, extending to choosing jobs and especially even losing leaving the country, are they're being challenged, because if a Chinese family or Chinese person, even an individual, were to leave the country and then go to whatever country that they go to and complain about the CCP, advocate for some reform, even not even revolution, just reform, just like going against the current policy of the government and therefore being an existential threat to the Chinese state, then that person will receive emails, calls, letters, like physically be spoken to by some Chinese national or agents
Yeah.
of the state, in their new place. And even if it's halfway across the world, and they'll say, we have your family, right? That actually happens. So in
Yeah.
China, they take their security very seriously, even when their security isn't even under threat.
And this goes not even just for the government, it's also a very big social norm for nationalists in just the Chinese populace to go after people who they see as treasonous or enemies or hypocrites, or not hypocrites, but anyone who could be seen as colluding with the West, with the enemies. Um, with the Chinese, one of the main sites, I believe it's Weibo, um, and that's on that site anyone who was kind of picked out as someone who could be supporting the West or being against the party, if they're not, if action isn't taken against them by the government, say they're just not even part of um, they're not even in China, they could just be some source out in the West that they just bring onto the website. They get mobbed on the internet. Like you think of cancel culture in the United States, they have that there in China. Um, Except there could be physical, not just legal, but physical consequences, especially if you're a person at target of these mobs. Threats, death threats, confrontations, arrests, magically disappearing for a couple months and then being shown on TV that you're fine. That happens. And sometimes it can be the government, but it can also be very self supported and self kind of like a self-fulfilling cycle sometimes with how the citizens will do it for the government while not exactly at their helm, still supporting the mission and the national sentiments that the Chinese government seek to promote. But yeah,
Right.
it could be the government definitely does it, but then the people do it as well, somewhat basically as agents of the state.
Right. It's when it comes to China, um the support of the party that they get from the people, it's incredibly coerced, but then also I'd have to, you know, um I've heard about a points system in China that they have for social
The
um
social credit score, yes.
exactly, the social credit score. Yeah, yeah. I know I haven't just like I didn't just think
That
this.
is, yeah, it is a thing that they use around there. I mean, you think the United States has credit scores, just for financial spending, all that kind of stuff. But with China, they include it for because um every citizen they have access or greater access to many different, publicly provided goods, like going to the grocery store, getting on a tram or anything like that. Since they're so connected, they include this social credit score with that. And so it is where I also probably do need to do some more research, but it can be taken down. Say you were to have done something maybe disloyal or someone was to find something out. It's a because it's so connected and it is, of course, another tool of the state. It can be manipulated. It can be used against you if you were to do something or say something or act some way that's against the wills of the state or disrupts the social harmony.
Right. And from what I understand, this social credit score, it can be very weaponized. Like if you have a higher social credit score, you will have like certain social benefits, maybe like
You get
like
more groceries, something like that.
cheaper
Yeah.
things, like more groceries, or cheaper schooling, because again, schooling is not exactly free in China. Like there's a lot of like certain items that you'll have to pay for. Um,
Hmm.
when it comes to preparation for school, even if officially it is free. And the yeah, like if you have a lower social credit score, then you will immediately be suspect, under the government, and you will be immediately suspected of doing some wrongdoing. And because they like certain big cities in the country like Shanghai or Beijing, or Guangzhou, or Hangzhou, they have a lot of heavy surveillance, and so all the people that live over there, they have cameras, pointing, and if they see your face, they can immediately identify you, and they can find your social credit score, and they can find your records, they can find like your banking information, some really important stuff. And but in the US, it just does not operate the same way. And that's one of the comparisons we hope to make. We may not be able to make it in this episode, but in America, they prioritize freedom over peace, but there's much greater of a balance. you know, like freedom doesn't just mean civil rights in the US. It also means like your ability to do things without government intervention. There's a greater balance between peace and freedom. In China, they lean so much over to peace that you just don't feel free anymore. In the US, you feel free, but there's also a certain collective patriotism in the country that helps maintain the peace.
Yeah. You have the freedom. You have very like so many different economic freedoms. You pick your job. You buy a new house, get all kinds of cars, all kind of goodies that you want. Make loan like pull out loans, all kinds of stuff. Um, Businesses also have freedom. They have, of course, private enterprise is a very big thing in the United States. It does exist in China, but it still is more. It's still under a great government overwatch and kind of government leaning. But with the United States, there are various different ways in which freedom is expressed. That doesn't just mean to the individual, but also sometimes even to objects. I mean, guns have rights. When you just look at a grander scale, we usually think about people having rights, and we got pieces of metal that can sometimes have greater Supreme Court protections than people, which could be pretty wild. But it just shows you to the extent on how much more emphasis the United States puts on freedom than it does for keeping peace or keeping harmony within its citizens, which can be both a good and a bad thing. We have the right to do so many things, but again, that means other things aren't as protected. I mean, we had to amend our constitution to get rid of slavery like 100 years after we became a country. We're not perfect at all, and sometimes giving states, the freedoms to do things as opposed to making it completely protected can bring upon a lot of prosecution. And of course, that's where we got with the latest Supreme Court ruling on abortion. But yeah, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in our next episode, is looking at the United States as it contrasts to what we just talked about here with China. Um, as I said, U.S. a little more freedom, China much more on the peace side. But the United States does have a semblance of balance, and we'll get into that. But yeah, unless you have anything else to add, Khalil, I think that's about it.
No, not really. I mean, we'll just have to be moving on to the end of this episode, but we'll explain more and more about why the U.S. Prioritizes freedom over peace, but then also has a greater balance. So anyway, um, with that, we are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you next time.
Yep.